By the Washington Post, the most influential American Muslim you've never heard of. That was a while ago when he testified before the Homeland Security Committee, and since then, I can assure you, many, many Americans have heard of our speaker. He's an American patriot, born in Ohio, raised in Wisconsin, took a United States Navy scholarship, went to medical school, served 11 years, active duty in the United States Navy. A couple of them on a ship, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. Was the staff internist for the U.S. Congress, the United States Supreme Court. Now is an internist and a nuclear cardiologist in Phoenix. He has had an outstanding medical career. He feels so strongly about his faith that he is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. And I say that again, it's for democracy. He's written a book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim's patriots fight to save his faith. I told you he was a patriot. He and I actually have something in common. He reported aboard the USS El Paso about 20 years after Ensign Miller reported aboard the USS El Paso. And I couldn't help but ask him, Doctor, I said, I was a navigator. I crossed the Atlantic Ocean 4 times with a watch, a sextant, and a nautical almanac. How did the navigator, he said, they just punched the button, Jim. That's all they had to do. They punched that button, GPS, computer, told them exactly where they were. I said, well, you know, that's just great. If you and I get recalled to active duty, you've still got a medical license, you're a doctor, you'll be head of the medical department. My skill set's gone. They'll bring me back as a seaman recruit. He's a good man, he's an American, and he is here to talk to us about his fight for the soul of Islam. Join me in a warm Rotary Club welcome for Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Thank you, Jim, and I want to thank your outstanding program committee for all of their work with Susan Jackson and Diane and Rob Couch, and it's just an honor to be back. I guess the only greater honor than being invited to what I understand is the largest Rotary Club in the country, and I send greetings, by the way, from Phoenix Rotary 100, my club in Phoenix. The only greater honor is to be invited back, and it's been quite a while, but a lot has happened since we last spoke. And I also have to recognize my cousin, Mohammed Jasser, who you guys have facilitated us coming back together. It's been a number of years, and he's a cardiologist in Anniston. Before he moved to Anniston, I thought Anniston was just a place he did chemical biological training in the military, which is where I did that. But he introduced me to my wife, Gada, and 20 years later, we are married with 3 kids who we love and adore in Scottsdale, Arizona. So thank you. Thanks for coming, Sad. You know, I think every time I just feel like I should start these talks with an apology, and that our faith community continues to fail the free world. Every time it seems as if I'm told every time that this is a timely time for you to talk, and I can't tell you how much that's told. I had speeches in November before Paris that then they say, oh, this is timely for you to speak. And then in March after Belgium, it's timely for you to speak. And it keeps getting closer and closer together. And at some point, we're going to realize that we are at war, and that the we part is the free society. And what I want to do with you over the next few minutes that we have together is sort of give you the 70,000-foot view of what it is that we are fighting. And first, I have to tell you humbly, as an American and as a Muslim, our prayers and our thoughts are with the people of Orlando. And the most vulnerable people in society today are the minorities, those who push the lines of free speech, as Charlie Hebdo did in Paris, the gay community, the Jewish community, who are targeted and have virtually no populations left in any Muslim majority countries in the Middle East. That doesn't happen by coincidence. It happens because there is a vicious, supremacist, theocratic ideology that wants to cleanse societies of any minority opinions, any dissidents, any of those who do not toe the line of the theocrats. And unfortunately, political correctness, and I'm not one for political correctness, but it's important that we get this right and get it correct about what we're fighting. When we undershoot, as we've seen for the last 7 to 8 years, we lose and we continue to be in surrender and on defense. when you overshoot and say all Muslims are the problems, we also will continue to be on defense and hand ISIS and the radicals exactly the narrative that they want. We have to get this right. And I'll tell you, as an American, I'm not expecting you all to leave here in 30 minutes and become experts in Islamic theocracy and help me figure this out. But what I do want you to do is tap back into what you understand to be American history. America, this greatest country on the planet, this city on a hill, was created by founding fathers who fought against what? They fought against theocracy. They fought against the domination of, and no offense to our priests and people of the cloth and that teach us our faith, but when priests and theocrats get involved in government and there's that mix, it's toxic. It never ends well. And our founding fathers fought for that defeat and created the greatest country, and the revolutions in the West were all based often in battles against theocracy. But that didn't come out of nowhere either. The premise for those battles were the Enlightenment, was the division and creation of a body of thought that believed that human beings should debate based in reason rather than based in scriptural exegesis. And we can get into some of the scriptural debate if you want in the Q&A. But at the end of the day, is the debate about literalism, or is it about choices and being free to have a personal relationship with God? And as much as that might seem esoteric, when a militant, yes, he might have had, Omar Mateen might have had some personal, psychological, psychiatric problems, but that personality became a receptacle for a virus, an ideology. He is not a lone wolf. I beg you, stop using the term lone wolf. These are not lone wolves. They are not alone. It is a global scourge, and violent homophobia is a natural byproduct of nonviolent homophobia. Violent anti-Semitism, which we see in Israel all the time, committed by radical Palestinians, is a natural byproduct of nonviolent anti-Semitism. And we see it in Europe and all over. Violent misogyny, domestic abuse, violent misogyny completed by radical Islamists in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, and in this country with honor killings. 5,000 honor killings have happened in the West in the past few years against women who choose to date, who choose not to wear the hijab, who choose to protest against their fathers, their brothers, or their uncles. And yet they're told in this country that they may not be able to have the same rights that other women have because of political correctness. Violent misogyny is a natural byproduct of nonviolent misogyny, and yet our entire apparatus in Homeland Security, right now you see all the media wondering, how did this happen in Orlando? What were the signals? And you see Director Comey correctly saying, well, he was apparently radicalized on the internet. The definition Mr. Comey is using for radicalization is, when did he start to think that he needed to become a soldier and get weapons and arms? That's the only paradigm they can use. He can't be held accountable. Our Bureau cannot be held accountable to using the paradigm that when did he start becoming a homophobe? When did he start becoming an anti-Semite? When his father was supporting the Taliban and putting these crazy YouTube videos for years about American conspiracies and all this nonsense that naturally was part of pushing his son into the pool of radicalization. That wasn't on the radar and shouldn't be on the radar so far, because when we have this discussion about should we call it radical Islamism or radical Islam, that naming is a very important conversation, because once you diagnose it, you can treat it. And this is why, yesterday Hillary Clinton threw her hands up on the Today Show and said, well, okay, fine, we'll call it radical Islamism. It's not just, and President Obama was lecturing us about, well, it doesn't matter what you call it. If I call it radical Islam, that's not going to fix everything by tomorrow. Well, actually, it will get us down the right path. And I think he realizes that once we call it radical Islamism, then our Homeland Security apparatus will then be engaged in the ideas of political Islam that are the underpinnings of the homophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-free speech, the blasphemy laws that they try to invoke in the West. All of these underpinnings of ideas become fodder for Homeland Security to monitor. But right now, our entire operation is a whack-a-mole program. Complete whack-a-mole program. We have to wait, and so far, This is why you have the largest agency in the government dedicated to this. They have to wait to figure out when will they become violent. So our program's called Countering Violent Extremism. CVE has become a global mantra. The White House convened all the governments, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, to help us figure out how to counter violent extremism and destroy ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. I'm sorry, but inviting those governments into the White House to help us fight this is like inviting the drug cartels of the planet to help you with drug violence. Because they are infinitely and forever wedded to political Islam. They might be monarchs or secular dictators, but the underpinnings of the ideology of the legal system of their government is wedded to the complete entanglement of Islam with their legal system. So the 70,000-foot view is Islam is going through a major crisis internally within its system. I thought the Arab awakening was going to be an opportunity in which we were finally going to separate ourselves, and this has happened since you and I last spoke many years ago. The Arab awakening changed everything. My grandfather, rest his soul, Zudi Jasser, went to his grave, as did my father, saying, the Syrian people deserve the government they have, because there was never a Syrian revolution to the scale that we see today. And these dictators, to their playbook, are two sides of the same coin of radical Islam. The Al-Sisis, the Mubaraks, the Sadats, the King Fahd, King Salman, and all these others are two sides of the same coin. They might claim to be with us against radical Islam, but they use the same underpinnings, and they use the foil of ISIS and Al-Qaeda as a justification for creating prisons in their entire country. Muslims who tell you what I would tell you in Saudi Arabia are in prison, being tortured, flogged in front of mosques every Friday in Jeddah and in Cairo. The moderate reform cannot happen in the Middle East with the dictators running the show. And this paradigm has been one, and in my book, one of the chapters is called Changing the Paradigm. We have been operating in the premise that we need to pick the lesser of evils in the Middle East. And that somehow, if we at least help the dictators that can be contained in their national borders, it'll prevent the radical Islamists from coming up. Meanwhile, the drugs they're dishing, the intoxicant of political Islam, is that drug that gets spread around the planet. And they use it as the opium of the masses in order to maintain legitimacy. Assad's bombing operation in Syria. If you feel he's bombing the areas of ISIS, you are sadly mistaken. Look at where they're bombing. They're bombing, and the Russians, our so-called allies, are bombing moderate rebel areas, what would be the future of Syria, and the ISIS areas in northeast Syria are being left alone. They might do some few symbolic bombings of Raqqa and other areas, but the bottom line is the French and the Americans and the Europeans are really the only ones trying to hit at the targets, but we're not even close to doing what we should be there. And that's the military part. The ideological part, which is where the weakness is greatest, and what the president and both parties wouldn't tell you. I mean, President Bush 43 had the same issue with not calling it radical Islam. Michael Gerson in the Washington Post, the former speechwriter for President Bush, has written this repeatedly, that no president should ever get into the language of theology because that is a landmine and it will cause the entire Islamic world to think that we're against them. That's what the kings and the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. If you don't know what the OIC is, learn what the OIC is. It is a voting bloc of 56 countries that are Muslim majority, that are the Islamic mafia of the planet. Some of them are more moderate than others, like Indonesia. Malaysia is not really any more moderate anymore. It's heading towards quite Islamist legalisms. But at the end of the day, the OIC is basically today's neo-caliphate. I call them the neo-caliphate because they vote as a bloc in the UN. And yes, that is who would be upset if we start calling it radical Islam, because they want their clerics to maintain control. And whether it's a secular party like the Ba'ath in Syria, who then employ their thugs of the Islamic clerical community, as Assad did, as Saddam Hussein did, and all of these dictators do, at the end of the day, you can't reform Islam unless you have a laboratory like we have in the West. And this is why we need to stop giving the American Muslim population a pass. I ask every Muslim I talk to and I spend time with, what is going to be your legacy? Is our legacy going to be Americans seeing us Simply do the paper press release condemnations of terrorism. What is that? Our organization has never released a condemnation of an act of terror. Because the day I have to prove to Americans that the targeting of the gay population, of press agencies and Charlie Hebdo or others, that somehow that is something I need to prove to America that I condemn, I've lost this battle. But what we do condemn is the ideas that feed that. And that's where I get labeled as a Muslim Uncle Tom, as a facilitator of anti-Muslim bigotry and all this kind of stuff, because they're in denial. And the groups that claim to speak for our community are completely in bed with the OIC governments. They will not condemn the Iranian regime and help the Green Revolution. The organizations that are Muslim in Washington will not condemn the Saudi regime and work to help a revolution start in Saudi Arabia. Why? Because just like the Qatar Foundation, what do you think the Qatar Foundation gets in the millions it gives the Clinton Foundation and actually many conservatives? Just next door, your good friends in Mississippi, Haley Barbour received $500,000 from the Saudis between March 2015 and March 2016 as part of his lobbying organization to help the Saudis contain the anti-Saudi sentiment in Washington. That money, what do you think they get in exchange for it? Not any positive influence towards, they don't really care whether we love or hate the Saudis. They want you to stay out of the business of helping reformers and helping counter political Islam. Because once America, which has done this before in our founding fathers, gets to help the reformers, the dissidents, those who leave Islam or stay in Islam, those who want free speech, then the whole game will change and revolutions will continue. And that, yes, I know many of you will say that'll become a mess. We're not getting much out of the Arab awakening. It's like treating cancer. The patient will not get better until they get sicker first. Syria, as horrific as the genocides there, and I say genocides, there's two genocides happening in Syria. Yes, there's the genocide from ISIS towards the Christians and Yazidis and minorities. But the larger genocide that preceded that America has yet to weigh in on, is the 500,000 Sunni Muslims that have been targeted and killed and eradicated and displaced with an ethnic cleansing facilitated by Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime. 500,000 dead, 10 million displaced out of a total population of 23 million. And their lobbyists have bought our isolationism, they've bought our war fatigue, and they bought our ability to stay away from the battle and the debate about Islam. So naming it makes a difference, because then, once you name it, you start to facilitate, as we did in the Cold War. Natan Sharansky said that he knew, while he was sitting in a cell in the Soviet Union, he knew he would be free when he heard Reagan call the Soviet Union the evil empire. And I can tell you, as an American Muslim who loves my country, the dissidents and the Islamic world will know they'll be free when they hear us call the Organization of Islamic Cooperation the evil empire. And when they hear us call radical Islamism the enemy, and an Islam based in liberty the allies of this country. Until we start making that designation, it will not happen. So what are some of the solutions? Simply put, the solution is about free speech. As long as you leave here advocating for free speech in Alabama, in Washington, in New York, in Paris, across the Muslim world, we need to advocate the same ideas domestically that we do abroad. When the Arab street sees us go and hug King Salman in Saudi Arabia, or he sees the chairman of our Joint Chiefs call for an essay contest to recognize how moderate and reformist King Abdullah, who passed away, was, the Arab street looks at that and says, Americans are part of the problem. We seem to want different freedoms for our own citizens than we do for theirs. And I'll give you some names. Raif Badawi, Walid Abu Khair. These are dissidents. Raif Badawi started an organization in Saudi Arabia called the Free Saudi Liberals. And instead, for that, all it was he wanted to be able to criticize the government, criticize the clerics, and reform Islam. And for hitting a like button on a Christian Facebook page, he has now been in jail for 4 years and has been flogged repeatedly publicly in front of the mosque in Jeddah. So the founding fathers of ISIS are the Saudi Wahhabi clerics. And yet we go and hug them, and President Obama goes and genuflects, and as did President Bush and all of our diplomats do. And I sit on the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom up until a few weeks ago. My term is completed, it's term limited. And I've gone to Saudi Arabia twice on that behalf. The toughest meeting I had wasn't with the Saudis, who were bending over themselves, not to get negative press from us, but to make sure we don't invoke sanctions. That's all they care about. And yet, the toughest meeting I had was with our ambassador to Saudi Arabia, who basically screamed at me that you can't be this confrontational with them. Change happens slowly. Talked to me about how some women are being put on mayoral councils in small towns in Saudi Arabia. And I said, listen, this window dressing is their SOP. This is how they do operations. They're going to continue to deceive you, as do Muslim organizations in America deceive you with so-called condemnations of, violent homophobia, while in the same time, the mosque that the president went to in February, the Islamic Society of Baltimore, has online a screed against homosexuals that was there when we protested. Our Muslim Reform Movement went to the mosque when President Obama went to the Islamic Society of Baltimore and protested. 3 or 4 women were out there, Muslim women holding signs. This is a mosque of gender apartheid that puts a curtain between men and women. There's no women on the board. They're homophobic. They might not be preaching terrorism, but they don't share American values. They ignored us as if we were basically trying to cause problems. And now comes Orlando. And do you think they're unrelated? And yet, Homeland Security can't monitor them. So, back to the Saudis. What can we do and what should we be doing? I'm not saying that we should antagonize all of our allies, but we need to at least hold them accountable to values. And we need to stop being so dependent upon their oil. Or at least be ready to welcome much higher gas prices. Because our national security is at stake. Let me give you a statistic. What percent of terror acts committed in the West do you think were committed by Sunnis versus Shia? It's close to 100% are Sunni. Why do you think that is? 97, 98% have been acts by Sunni radicals, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas. These are all Sunni organizations versus Shia, which are Iranian-based or Iraq or Lebanese, where the Shia population is. And Hezbollah, for example, is a known Shia radical organization. The reason is not that the Shia Islamists are less radical. The Death to America chants are all over Iran and Hezbollah has committed many acts of terror in Israel. The bottom line has to do with the money. The Iranians have never been able to flow money into mosques and into Islamic organizations in the West. We actually shut down a $500 million operation in New York because of the sanctions against Iran. 4 mosques were shut down in a tower in New York City, the Alevi Foundation. Look up that case. Department of Treasury. And now that's all changed. As of 3 months ago, wait for the wave of terror that's going to come from the Shia radicals, because now we have lifted and handed the Iranians $150 billion as a result of the Iran deal, which is also smoke and mirrors. But the money that's been released is now going to be used to flow their ideas to mirror Sunni radicalism. And so the Saudis purchase, Uber just last week, took $3.5 billion from Saudi Arabia. Why? David Plouffe said it was to open the markets in Saudi Arabia. Make no mistake, that promiscuity, that economic promiscuity we have with Sunni governments that are militant and don't share our ideas is the very source of what's radicalizing our faith community. Because if you go into the mosques, it's the Saudi Qurans that are there, not the modern interpretations like our family's interpretations or others that can't even find a publisher to publish it. The Saudi billions that are intermeshed promiscuously in our economy are what are allowing them to do that. Imagine if when we were fighting the Soviets, we said, let's work with other communist governments, the Italian communists and others, to work economically with them to fight the Soviets. We would have never done that. And yet that is our policy today, and we're wondering why the war keeps coming towards us. President Obama sold us a bill of goods by telling us that if we withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan, the war will go away. Just last week when he was being interviewed, he said, if I was to be, on Jimmy Fallon, he said, if I was to be, come back, this is the best time to be alive. I tweeted out at the time, I guess he's not talked to any Muslims in Syria or Saudi Arabia or Iran or anywhere. I mean, he's focused on if he lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I guess it's a great place to be born. Not in Pulse nightclub, Orlando, Chattanooga, San Bernardino. These are symptoms of a much bigger disease. And the symptom is not just violence or terrorism or psychiatric illness. The symptom is political Islam. In the last couple minutes, I want to look at solutions. And as I mentioned to you, the problem is free speech. Atheists and secular bloggers are being assassinated on the streets in Bangladesh every day. Countries, as we were talking, Senegal and Malaysia, that were perceived to be moderate are becoming more and more extreme. Bosnia, which scholars helped influence the way I think about Western ideas, is now becoming more and more Wahhabi in its orientation because of the Saudi cancer. In the end of my book, I have a letter to my children in which I tell them, you will know that we have won this war when the beautiful spirituality that you see inside the Grand Mosque of Mecca, where you have people of all races, men and women walking next to each other, not separated, and simply praying to the God of Abraham that we share. When you see that spiritual harmony outside that mosque, not just inside it, but outside it. And outside that mosque right now is the most draconian, evil government on the planet. And it has spread its ideas to Qatar, to Pakistan, to all of the other Islamic regimes that continue to spread Islamic theocracy. Voltaire's biographer said that he may disagree. We may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That should be the premise of what we are defending across the planet. As our presidential candidates now dysfunctionally try to discuss what the war is and what we're fighting, this is what we're fighting for. And the question is, does America stand for anything? And I'll tell you, if America does not get into this battle, we're going to lose. Because we need somebody standing up for free speech for those who other than the United States can defend the free thinkers on the planet. The Natan Sharanskys exist in the prisons across the Middle East. And as long as America sits this out, this war will come here. And the reason it comes here is not because of our soldiers. It comes here because they are threatened by freedom. And they have to extinguish this light of freedom if they're going to spread theocracy across the planet. So at the end of the day, what we're battling, I call a battle between Islamo-patriotism and American or patriotism towards the liberty secular state. What attracts young Muslims, a nurse in Mississippi that decides to become a radical and join ISIS, or in Colorado, they get converted and all of a sudden 3 years later they're joining ISIS. How does this happen? Because ISIS gives them something to die for. So we're not going to win this if you continue the whack-a-mole, let's try to tell them violence is bad and find something else. The way to win this, one of our board members, Samir Abdul Khalik, just finished and graduated from West Point. Because not only is he a Muslim, but he said he would rather die for America than nothing else. Until we have Muslims lining up in droves to want to die for America, to want to die for freedom rather than wanting to die for ISIS, that's the only way to inoculate them against radicalism, is giving them something else to die for that is not Islamist. Our solution is the Muslim Reform Movement. I would ask you to look at that. Our Muslim Reform Movement has a 2-page declaration that has 12 points. And it said, we as Muslims in our organization convened this on December 4th. I'd ask you to look at the video online. It was a press conference that 15 of us spoke at. And it was probably the most moving thing I've ever participated in. We convened this conference. I brought them together December 2nd, and San Bernardino happened on the 3rd. And we were all together. We couldn't believe that we were doing this work as San Bernardino was happening. And we thought, I called it at the time the Summit of Reformist Muslims. I brought in folks from Canada, Europe, and the US, 15 organizations. And at the end of that summit, we said, you know what, let's put out a declaration. We know that the Islamic world, when it comes to reform, is on the 1-yard line on the opposing side. But what does the goalpost look like on the other side of the end zone, 99 yards away? The goalposts include Muslims who don't condemn the act only, but Muslims who will tell you and sign on the dotted line that we reject the caliphate, we reject violent jihad, no exclusions, no ifs, ands, or buts. We reject the Islamic State concept, not only ISIS, but all Islamic states. We believe in the separation of mosque and state. We believe in the equality of men and women, and all those based on sexual identity, faith identity. We signed that declaration saying we do not believe Muslims have a monopoly on heaven, that other faiths have equal access to heaven. And if you look at that, Anyone who signs that is clearly part of the American contract, the social contract of belief in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So when you're asking, how do we vet refugees? How do we vet Homeland Security clearances? This guy, Omar Mateen, had a clearance, was working in a defense contracting security firm. Because we're not screening for Islamist ideology. We're screening for terrorists, which is an act. It's not an ideology. In the Cold War, even despite the fact that we were screening for communist ideology, we still had many that went through because they lied. But still, we need to begin to screen for Islamism and jihadism, and our two-page declaration can be used as the beginning of that conversation. Take it to your churches, your mosques, your synagogues, ask them. We mailed it 2 months ago to every Muslim organization, every leader, celebrity imam, every mosque. A few have sent it back. Most have been silent. The other organizations put out this OrlandoStatement.com. I'd ask you to look at it. It's basically an apologetic that on the one hand condemns it, and on the other hand also tells America to be careful about the backlash against Muslims and does this moral equivalency, which is nonsense. So if you believe in Voltaire's word, if you believe that America has a role in the world, that we can't win this militarily, we will never be able to kill all the jihadists. The Islamists are 300 to 500 million people because there's about 1.6 billion Muslims. So unless we have a plan to put a wall around America, which won't work, because most of these people committing these acts are American-born citizens, or at least have been here for a long time, or we plan to convert a quarter of the world's population, which is obviously not a plan, or we work with those who share our values and defend their free speech and defend the reform. So until we start using what I call the R word, which is Islamic reform, we're not going to get a solution. Thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Is there a role for women to push reform in your religion?
Absolutely. There's a documentary we helped create called Honor Diaries. You can look at it, honordiaries.com. And if you look at the organizations that signed our declaration, 6 or 7 of them are headed by women's organizations. This is a nonpartisan issue. You know, I might be on the conservative side of the political spectrum, but there were many feminist groups, gay rights groups that participated, and I can tell you that the women's organizations, and this is where I'm disappointed by some of the women's rights groups, not only in America, but even if you look at, for example, Hillary Clinton's foundation, the Clinton Foundation, has an organization called NoCeilings.org, which goes across the world to do work for women. And they've done some work in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but 90-some% of the millions they've spent on no glass ceilings for women has been not in the Muslim countries. So it's been in Africa, it's been in China, Asian countries, etc., but they've avoided pushing the envelope in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., because of I think, the money's coming from Qatar, etc., that poison the well. The solution will be women's rights, countries where women can't even drive, the Sharia courts. Most of those who've defended, one of the greatest examples, I think, is Muhammad Yunus, who won a Nobel Prize in economics in 2005 for giving microloans to women in Muslim countries. Once they had a microloan and they were able to do their own businesses, they were able to separate from their misogynistic father, brother, cousin who was controlling them and tell them, you know what, your interpretation of the Quran is wrong. The Quran says I have equal rights, this is a partnership. But they can't do that until they're economically independent. Women who are economically dependent can't separate. And in this country, we have to hold Muslims who have arbitration systems, Sharia courts that they do inside our country, exposed with the antiseptic of sunlight, what's happening in those courts. Because many women are sucked into abusive court systems that are done under the name of Islam, where imams are told that they're being abused, and the imam tells them, go back, give it 3 times until you need to divorce. And they're not being held accountable. So yes, women need to be at the head of this reform movement.
Gate Shaw had asked permission to ask.
Well, I think you really sort of answered what I was thinking earlier, and that is, in my understanding of traditional Islamic teaching, that jihad has got more to do with doing war with evil within you than war with evil without you or outside of you. And actually, Rabbi Miller and I talked about this, and I guess jihad has been integral to Islamic tradition forever, this sort of expansiveness, but I never really thought of it as that the evil one was always somehow beyond yourself. Can you just talk about how that notion has become so integral to the expansive terrorism that we're experiencing?
So his question is about jihad and what role does that play? It is a central role, to the point that we in our Muslim reform movement have said that we should have a jihad against jihad. Because the way that it's been promoted, the branding of jihad, listen, there's the apologetic about what jihad really means, and that apologetic is true. I have a number of friends, their first name is Jihad. Do you think their parents wanted to call them holy war? That was not what the mother or the father wanted to name. The jihad means, just like zuhud means, zudi means devoted to God, jihad means internally struggling to better oneself for God. Now that's one definition. The other definition is a just war, a jihad for your country, a jihad for righteousness, and that could be militant. So how do you defeat this concept? How do you reform it into a modern concept? It's about the Islamic State. You cannot defeat jihad as long as the Islamic State anywhere has oxygen. Because listen, we were in the Navy. I signed up for an 8-year commitment. Let's say 6 years into that commitment, I decided, you know what, I changed my mind. I want to leave. You can't do that. And there's a reason you can't, even in an American military, decide I'm going to leave once you've signed a commitment, because otherwise we'd have no unit cohesion. We would fall apart. So before the separation of mosque and state, there were religious militaries. And when the Prophet had a military that was fighting as a Muslim military, the only way to maintain cohesion is to tell them, when you're fighting a jihad, you can't leave. So that's where flows laws of apostasy that are hijacked. Even at the time of the Prophet, the Muslim military was different than the rest of the Muslims. So if you're going to reform the ideas that say that an apostate who leaves Islam should be killed, which sounds like a cult, it is a cult when it's defined that way. But yet, the way to reform that is to say that that applied to the Muslim military in 620 AD, and it doesn't apply anymore. And that the better system is to say that you have loyalty to the military of a secular state, and that is the only thing you would die for. And we as Muslims need to say, we're done, and this is in our reform document, we're done with any Muslim militaries. Because as long as a Muslim-identified military has oxygen anywhere on the planet, you can radicalize ISIS folks to want to die for that jihad. But once there's no more Muslim, just like today, the reason Christian crusades and other concepts of a Christian military died off was the Establishment Clause and the separation of church and state. And nowhere anymore do I see, folks dying for the Christianity and promoting that, but rather for their nation states. And that's the only way to kill the oxygen of jihad.
Thank you. Great. Dr. Jasser, thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. We'd like you to have a copy of the four-way test written by our former president, Bill Hall, and we're going to make a contribution in your honor to our signature project, the Rotary Trail, which you saw in the video earlier. I'm going to release you to head to the door while I wrap up, because Dr. Jasser has agreed to, if you want to make a break for it, this is your chance. Dr. Jasser has agreed to sign copies of his book, which he referred to in his talk, outside. If you have questions, I'm not saying you got to buy a book, but it'll put you in line to ask a question for Dr. Jasser. But what a thought-provoking talk, and one that we very much appreciate. We hope you'll come back sooner this time to keep us informed. Immediately following this meeting is a board meeting. Please don't forget to come downstairs if you're on the board. Also, don't forget that we are all invited to the Rotaract annual meeting, which takes place in this room tomorrow, but you need to give them a heads up so they'll know you're coming. And with that, we stand adjourned.